The Shire theme from the Lord of the Rings film trilogy is even more clever than you think. The Shire theme is one of the best known and best loved themes in the soundtrack to The Lord of the Rings that was composed by Howard Shore. But why is the Shire theme so effective at telling the story of the Hobbits and the Shire itself? Well, there's a bunch of technical things that Howard Shore built into this theme, and whether or not you know very much about music, they'll speak to you. The first thing to know is that this song is written in the key of D. Again, don't worry about it if you don't have a background in music. All you need to know is that this is probably the most common key for folk songs of the British Isles. When you listen to fiddle tunes or songs played on the tin whistle, many of these songs are played in the key of D. This means that this tune is done in a way that the hobbits themselves would have done it because they represent the people of England, the common, ordinary people, and their common, ordinary folk music. It wouldn't make sense to set this song in a key that the hobbits themselves wouldn't use. Another thing I really like about the Shire theme is that it only exists within a single octave. An octave is a set of 8 notes, so if you go from one D on the piano up to another D. That was an ordinary major scale played in the key of D. Now here's the Shire tune, and you'll see that it's played only using notes that exist within that D scale. The whole song fits within 1D scale. It doesn't go anywhere beyond that. But why? Why would Howard Shore do that? Well, here's the really interesting part. He only wrote themes for the various people of Middle-earth in the Lord of the Rings soundtrack that those people could have produced themselves using the level of technology that they had. The hobbits live in a low-tech society. They have things like water wheels, wagons. They can clearly do iron work because you can see that they have hinges on their doors and doorknobs and things like that. But this is not an industrialized society. They don't have factories. They don't have the ability to produce really complicated things, including musical instruments. So none of the things they would play would have things like, say, valves on a trumpet or a slide on a trombone. These things are very sophisticated, and you just can't produce them with the level of technology that you would find in a place like Hobbiton. What you would find is a tin whistle. These are very simple instruments, and they're indigenous to the British Isles. They're a critical part of the sound of British and Irish folk music, and they're exactly the sort of thing that the hobbits would have been able to produce with the technology that they had. Back in the day, these were made of tin, and they were also sometimes called penny whistles because they sold for a penny. These days, they're more likely to be made of brass, although the ones used in the Lord of the Rings soundtrack are sort of a fancy, upgraded version of a tin whistle, and they're often referred to as a low whistle. Tin whistles are most commonly sold in the key of D, although you can get them in other keys, and they really have a fairly limited range. By covering up the holes that are along the whistle, you can produce different notes. You can produce more than one D scale on this by blowing harder into the whistle, and then you get higher tones, but you're really not going to get much more than 3 or 4 notes before it starts to sound shrill. The use of this instrument shows that Howard Shore really thought about the text of The Lord of the Rings and the world it was depicting when he wrote the soundtrack. He could have just written the song for a regular flute, but instead he thought, no, what's the kind of flute that the hobbits would actually have? What's a tune that they could write with the technology they had and the instruments they had? That's why this is the voice of the Shire, and when you hear it in the soundtrack, it feels so authentic and true to the story. The other instrument that's used to play the Shire theme is the violin, or the fiddle as it would be referred to in British folk music. Again, this is used because that's the kind of thing that the hobbits would have been able to produce using the level of technology they have. So when these themes are played, It's not just expressing a simple form of folk music that the hobbits would have recognized, but it's using instruments that have the very voices that the hobbits themselves would have used. Whenever the Shire theme is used in the Lord of the Rings soundtrack, it's always to help part of the story, whether that's to show what's going on with a character or to further something going on in the plot. There'll be little flickers of it used. For example, when Sam and Frodo are lost in Emmenwheel in the Two Towers, there's a moment where Sam drops something while they're dangling from a rope, and he says, catch it, don't lose it." And Frodo, at great risk to himself, manages to reach out and catch this little box. And it turns out that the only thing inside is just a little bit of seasoned salt, a little taste of home, a piece of the Shire that they brought with them. And it was that important to Sam. And you kind of hear this little flicker of the Shire theme in that moment.
It's a little bit of home.
Okay, so what just happened there? When Frodo said, "It's a little bit of home," all of a sudden you get a tiny piece of the Shire theme. Up until this moment, all we've heard is the whistling winds in the Emmenwheel. But now we get just a couple of notes. We get the D, the F sharp, the A, and the B. Except, because Howard Shore is so smart, he's done something incredibly clever. He's not having one of the usual instruments play it. You're not getting the tin whistle. You're not getting the violin. Those things don't belong in this place. They're too happy. They're too much of home. We only get a little piece. Instead, he's handed off this bit of the melody to a clarinet. Clarinets tend to have sort of a mournful, sad sound if they're played in the right way. He also did something even more clever, and I'm going to try not to geek out too much here, but he brought the whole melody down by a step. So what that means is it's played a little lower than usual, because guess what? Sam and Frodo are feeling a little lower than usual. So instead of the proper melody, what you're getting is this. So that's the same tune, but it's just brought down a little bit because their spirits are down. This is fantastic musical storytelling, and it shows that he really paid attention to the book, thought about the characters, thought about the text, and wanted to transform it into music properly. Something very similar happens a few minutes later when Merry and Pippin are being carried across the plains by the horrible band of Uruk-hai. Merry's in pretty bad shape. Pippin calls out for some sort of water or medicine, and the Uruks use this as an excuse to be nasty to him because they're Uruks. Pippin's really stressed, and Merry uses this opportunity to show just a little bit of that hobbit pluck.
Merry. Hello, Pip. You're hurt. Fine. It was just an act.
He manages to dig deep and find a little bit of humor because he's worried about Pippin. You get just another tiny piece of the Shire theme in this moment.
Hello, Pip.
However, the very best use of this theme happens in The Return of the King, at the coronation of Aragorn. It's the part where he comes up to the four hobbits, and then they begin to bow to him, and Aragorn says, "My friends, you bow to no one." What happens next is a masterpiece of musical storytelling. The themes of Gondor are always represented with brass instruments, but they're beautiful, mellow instruments. Sounds like the euphonium and the French horn, and trombones, but played softly and gently. And this represents the high level of technological sophistication that existed in Gondor. They would have had the ability to produce things like brass sheet metal and instruments with really complicated valves and other moving parts. Whenever you hear those themes, they're represented by those rich, pure, beautifully played pieces of technology, and that supports Tolkien's idea that technology can be used for good and sophisticated purposes. This is in contrast to evil themes, which are also used playing brass, but they tend to be played very harshly with a lot of clanging percussion going along with it. And this shows Tolkien's revulsion at the misuse of technology for destructive purposes. So now back to this scene where Aragorn is about to bow to the hobbits, and then the entire kingdom of Gondor will follow along. What happens in this moment is that you hear the Shire theme being played big and grand on violins, but if you listen underneath it, there's this pulse of those brass instruments. So you literally have the sound of Gondor not taking the melody, it's taking a back seat. It's just pulsing on the main beats, supporting that Shire theme. So even musically in this moment, the soundtrack is having Gondor bow to the Shire. It's an absolute masterpiece of songwriting, and it gives me chills every time I hear it. I hope this helps you understand just a little bit more about how music can be used to tell stories, even stories from a novel. Howard Shore was very, very careful about the way he translated the story into musical format. He didn't just compose pretty sounds to go along with cool moving pictures in the movie. He really, really thought about how his choices of instrument and melody style, and then the way that those interact with the other instruments and melodies in the film, would help support the storytelling going on the screen. That's why this soundtrack is so good and so beloved. That's why you can put it on and you can hear the story of The Lord of the Rings. It almost works like an opera or a ballet when you hear it. It's not just sounds, it's not just music, it's the story in the novel translated into musical form. When children are younger, they tend to learn about music in a pretty basic and direct way. They're taught to play an instrument or they learn to sing a song, but they're not ready to start learning about the structure of music or how to write their own compositions. By the time they're teenagers, though, they're usually very interested in these things. A kid might be ready to start a garage band or try to arrange a song for a school choir concert. Examining the work of great musical storytellers like Howard Shore can help them get off to a great start. I'm looking forward to examining the other musical themes in The Lord of the Rings, especially the one for Rohan, and talking about how they take the text of the book and transform it into music. But for now, what's your favorite use of the Shire theme in the 3 films that were directed by Peter Jackson? Which one just makes the hairs on your arms stand up? Which one brought a tear to your eye? I'd love to hear from you.